The sitting is resumed. Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I rise to contribute to this debate, and in particular to support this appropriations bill, I think that everything that has been said on the floor thus far suggests, Mr. President, that we are having this debate at a particular moment in the transformation of Barbados, in the transitioning process and repositioning process of Barbados. It is a moment, Mr. President, that I believe calls for three important things. It calls for, Mr. President, transformational and inspirational leadership. It calls for the right policy mix, because as a country is transitioning, as a country is attempting to move from one position to another, it needs within that moment to ensure that it has, as I said, sound leadership, transformational, inspirational, the right mix of policies, but more importantly, Mr. President, sound vision. More importantly, Mr. President, sound vision. Mr. President, there's a quote, yeah? For a blind man, any of us, if we lost our sight, Mr. President, I believe that we could contend. We could contend, we could learn to adapt. But Mr. President, what is more fundamental is to have sight, but actually lack vision. Sight, but actually lack vision. So we're in a moment where we need the bringing together of these three elements. And I am both reflective, Mr. President, because I must say that this debate here and in the other place have made me proud to belong to a party and a government that is able to deliver all three. A party and a government that is able to deliver all three to meet that moment of transformation that this country is about. Mr. President, we have been told in this debate that we ought not to reflect, we ought not to look back, that we ought only to deal with the now. And you know, Mr. President, I struggle and I try not to walk in judgment, because we've heard a lot about judgment. I think we forget that judgment happens both ways. Because it is uncomfortable for me to have someone say we ought not to look back when we're talking about social and economic development, as if one can divorce, Mr. President, your present context from your recent past. As if when we are talking about development for small island developing states, for countries like Barbados, that we have an opportunity to create a dividing line at one point, as if the trajectory of our history, as if the past leadership and its policies don't impact on what it is that we can do today and the pathway that we have to be able to build on, Mr. President. It is, Mr. President, that statement, that suggestion is a sound of political immaturity, because only someone politically immature, Mr. President, could think that you can come to have a discussion about social and economic development of a country, but not think that you have to contend with the past and what has gone before. And I can understand the discomfort with having to contend with one's legacy when one's legacy is so disdainful. Mr. President, they don't want us to speak to that legacy that was left by the Democratic Labour Party. They don't want us to remind that in 2017, trade unions and the private sector had to be on the street, Mr. President, because of the high level of taxation that was announced in the May budget of the then administration, when the then Prime Minister talks about lions and sheep, Mr. President. When the then Prime Minister was disrespectful of the social partnership and say, I don't care, we're going to come and tell me, the government, we can do what we want, Mr. President. That is the legacy that they don't want us to remember in this place. They don't want us to remember, Mr. President, but I can remind people, because we cannot, Mr. President, divorce, as I have said, what it is that we have to do as a government, this mission transformation that this government is building on with where we started. And I will remind Mr. President that Barbados lost access to international capital markets following 23 downgrades by rating agencies, Mr. President. 23 downgrades, Mr. President. International reserves dwindled, Mr. President, from 2.24 billion at the beginning of 2008 to approximately 420 million or 4 weeks of import cover by May 2018. And don't let us talk about the metrics, because they tell us we don't know about inclusive growth. They want to lecture us, the Barbados Labour Party, Mr. President. Lecture us about people and policies for people and say, oh, it's not only about GDP. Will we look at them record, Mr. President? Look at the record, because the facts are there as well. So do we talk about facts? That during that period of negative to low economic growth, there was also declined investment in education, in health, in public safety, in social welfare. And all of a sudden, we are to be tutored, Mr. President. The Barbados Labour Party is to be tutored by the government that removed the very stepping stone from the same middle class that they want to tell us about, Mr. President. By removing access to free university education, that is the legacy of the Democratic Labour Party, Mr. President. That is what we had to come in, Mr. President, and contend with. And the government that they want to lecture about people and social enfranchisement and inclusive growth is the government that, not in the face of abundance, Mr. President, not in the face of when things were going right, but coming into a government facing that history that I just spoke to. And one of the first policies that this government did was to return that stepping stone to the same middle class, Mr. President, because we understood fundamentally that when you talk about people, it is education that moves them, Mr. President. And even despite the fact that we had to contend with COVID, Mr. President, a freak storm, ashfall, and a hurricane, Mr. President, all of those things this government contended with. All of those things, and still contending with. And they would want to, Mr. President, look at the policies of the government in an isolated way, because we live in the world by ourselves, Mr. President. Because Barbados exists only in the 166 square miles. We don't live in a world, Mr. President, where there is war in Ukraine. We don't live in a world, Mr. President, where there is war in Gaza, Mr. President. And all of those things, if you look, Mr. President, I have all the evidence here, and I can quote from Deloitte, Mr. President. I can quote from EY, Mr. President. I can quote from Ernst & Young is EY, the other one, can't even remember the other one name, PwC. All of them have said that the inflation in Barbados is a result of the international inflationary crisis that is happening due to escalation of prices and food prices globally, Mr. President. We do not live in the world by ourselves, Mr. President. And there is no line in the sand to be drawn, Mr. President, where we can demarcate where Barbados currently is and what this government is doing from both the history and how it is connected, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to remind, because sometimes we can have a bit of a short memory, that even in the midst of when we did not have the bounty and we were going through the major disruption from COVID, it was this government that increased non-contributory pensions, Mr. President, from $155 to $225 per week, Mr. President. People, Mr. President. People. It's people? It's people? I wasn't sure. But I think it is people. I think it is people, Mr. President. Was it people, again, when we did the business interruption benefit to help small businesses? It was people, Mr. President. It was business. I have to ask the question. Because from everything that we have heard in here, it wasn't people. It was something from Mars. Was it, Mr. President, people when we had the Vulnerable Families Survival Program providing $600 a month to support vulnerable families? Was it people, Mr. President, when we recapitalized the NIS to pay unemployment benefits, Mr. President? It was people, Mr. President. Nobody can lecture the Barbados Labour Party about people. And certainly not this government, not this party, the Democratic Labour Party, telling us about people. They want to tell us, Mr. President, that we are not doing anything for the people with the cost of living, Mr. President. That the Prime Minister spends 4 minutes or how much ever she is. I can go through all of the economic analysis on the budget. I got them all here, pull up on my laptop from every agency that is able to look at the Prime Minister's budget and pull out all of the policies, Mr. President, having to do with people-centered development, having to do with growth, Mr. President, all of them, having to speak to the anti-inflationary policies. You only spend 4 minutes on them, but I could pull out and I could quote 2 paragraphs, Mr. President, if I wanted to, on what they have quoted, Mr. President, about this government's effort at people-centered growth, Mr. President. That is in there. But apparently, Mr. President, apparently, you only have ears to hear. But maybe, Mr. President, didn't hear because what we get, unfortunately from the Democratic Labour Party, is a penchant to grab the headlines with histrionics and shouting and oh, poor me and being the victim. And like I said, Mr. President, it points to a political immaturity, a party that does not understand that it needs to demonstrate that it has the intestinal fortitude to be able to come to the people of Barbados and say, we have done you wrong. I agree, Mr. President. The Prime Minister said it in the other place. We need a strong opposition. She said it. And I agree with her. We are yet to see one, Mr. President. We are yet to see one, so we wait in hope. Oh, come on now. We wait in hope, Mr. President, that one will arise. And Mr. President, I also understand the level of response that we have gotten here and the other place to the government's program. I would be a little bit intimidated too if I had to contend with my own legacy. And also as well, particularly in this place, because you have to look across this side and to remember that both of your leaders come from within the bowels of the Barbados Labour Party, Mr. President. Come from within the bowels. You had to go looking and could not find. We don't exactly know who is who. I think you got a chief administrator who's ordered the toilet paper and fixed the windows and something else. And I don't even know. And I could understand, Mr. President, in particular for one of the honourable senators. Can't find, ain't so sure where to land, ain't so sure how to speak, ain't so sure what to deliver. And so I understand, Mr. President, the level of response. I understand that you're going to be a little intimidated. I understand that with your first estimates that it's going to be difficult to mount a coherent and truthful discussion, Mr. President. Particularly given the history, Mr. President. Disjointed history. The flagging history. The runboat history, Mr. President. All of them history. All of them history, Senior Minister. All of them history, Senior Minister. I understand. So I can give him a little latitude. But the Barbadian public deserve better and more. Mr. President, when we talk about the issue of transformation, because we've had a lot of discussion about that, we've been asked, what is the ethos and the development ethos that underpins what we are doing and underpins our programs? And, you know, all of the waxing philosophical. And we have been asked as well, Mr. President, to look at the fact that we have what are said to be contradictions, that we have all of this excellent programming about building climate resilience and all of these things, but there are contradictions, Mr. President. That's what we're told. And again, Mr. President, all of that is very interesting. Because really, when we look at the trajectory of development, when countries are in transition, Mr. President, in transition, because transformation is not a full stop, it is a process. It is a process. And in the process of transformation, of course, you will have discontinuities because old policies will meet new policies on the road to transformation. So that contradictions are inherent. And in fact, economic policy, particularly economic policy, looking at the development trajectories of developing countries, identify that you will have such contradictions. In fact, it is suggested that structural transformation for developing countries inherently have contradictions. Inherently even suggests that one of the big contradictions is the extent that you can have a level of inequality as you do structural transformation, because as you move along that process and as you try to change out one from industrial even to technological, the extent that you can then transform and bring the economy and the people along all at the same time. Mr. President. So what we heard so philosophically and so eloquently, Mr. President, suggested is a basic principle of transformation. How else do you transform? Mr. President, it's like saying, I have a Christian, Reverend Morris, I get saved, and for the day that I get saved, I become more holy. I forget past. I don't got content with the flesh. I forget what Paul tell me about striving every day, Mr. President. I forget all of that, Reverend Morris. It is the process, that is the process of transformation. And that is the process that this government is on. And so in that context, as we move along there, Mr. President, and that is why this program here, and it's interesting, because we want them to be able, as per usual, those that have lack that vision and don't understand the true nature of transformation, see things only in a silo, Mr. President. So they would want to pick off one or two programs. They would want to speak to what was laid in the other place. But they forget that we had a mission transformation budget in 2023, Mr. President. That's also still part of the agenda. They would want to forget that this government as well laid Burke 2.0, which set out the government's agenda, which, Mr. President, for those that want to understand the ethos that we are working towards, said essentially that Burke 2.0 was about creating inclusive, Mr. President, inclusive growth while stabilizing the economy and having a sustainable debt. Inclusive, that's where it started, Mr. President. Because again, no one can look and tell us about how growth is not a sufficient driver or measurement of development. We know that. BERT 2.0 says it. And BERT 2.0 identified the pillars as well upon which we were intending to continue to rescue this economy. And if you look at the pillars of BERT 2.0, Mr. President, you will see that each of the pillars align to the government's program as established. Mr. President, it talks about incentivizing investment in climate resilient infrastructure and in green transition. And I could talk about the high-level policies, Mr. President, but I ain't gonna talk about the high-level policies because we're talking about people. So I can speak to the provision of the hurricane straps to low-income households. Who them for again? People. Them is people or them is, okay, that's not the same people, the same things that from Mars. Them is people providing hurricane straps to poor income households. I just want to make sure that I am clear, Mr. President. That is people. Mr. President, it says investment in enhanced skills training and education, especially in niche sectors in a high-skilled, to build a high-skilled, knowledge-based economy, digitization, AI, robotics, cybersecurity training. Mr. President, we're talking fast, right? I am pulling the information from where I'm talking fast. Mr. President, this government provided, through the Ministry of Education, training for young people in cybersecurity, Mr. President, but we didn't just provide training for them. We gave them training and we gave them jobs. We had over, I believe it was 102 persons, Mr. President, trained. 99 of them got jobs, Mr. President. 99 of them have jobs, Mr. President. They're getting paid, Mr. President, at $130,000 US is the average salary, Mr. President. No reduced hours, Mr. President. We are doing the same thing with AI, Mr. President. We are doing the same thing with AI, Mr. President. It is artificial intelligence. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, this is why we have Coursera, that the government engaged in a relationship with, through the National Transformation Initiative for Coursera, to be able to offer free, Mr. President, free training, Mr. President, and that's for over 45,000 Barbadians. 45,000 Barbadians have been able to be trained, Mr. President, under the Coursera to upskill so that they can be able to transition to new jobs, Mr. President. Reinforce old skills, but also new jobs that are emerging in the market, because we are not planning for the Barbados today, for the people of Barbados today. Vision, Mr. President. We're planning for the Barbados tomorrow. So we have done that investment, Mr. President. Mr. President, in that same NTI program, if everybody would recall, during COVID, under that same NTI program, Mr. President, we implemented the BEST program, which gave companies the choice of paying severance to their workers, or they could accept grants and a share of investment from government to re-engage the workers and deliver training. Mr. President, that was worth over $300 million, Mr. President. 15,000 workers and an estimated 32,000 workers in tourism-related jobs and services benefited people. I don't know. I think they're people. I think they're people. It's the workers, but people, Mr. President, particularly women, Mr. President, who were able to get training, Mr. President, and upskill, Mr. President. This is the investment that we are talking about in people. Not just puffing up and beating up, but practical. Let's put the records, Mr. President, side by side. Let's put the records side by side. We are told that the opposition doesn't have to provide solutions because all they have to do is defend. But I've also heard about the notion of new politics, that we're not doing the old politics, that we got a new style opposition. Where the policies that we can match. Well, I want to know, we are doing people, I'm still searching, Mr. President. I am still searching, Mr. President. We're not doing people, what is your solution, Mr. President? We have not heard it. We have not heard it. The Construction Gateway, Mr. President, program, the Construction Gateway, and Mr. President, I see a little bit of discomfort at the bottom of that table. They got to open up the shirt. They got to open up the shirt, Mr. President. They got to wiggle in the seat because it get a little bit uncomfortable now, Mr. President. Because again, it bringing facts and figures, Mr. President. I bring in facts and figures. I bring in practical examples of programs that this government has done for who? People, Mr. President. Training output, Mr. President. Let me tell you, Mr. President, over 2,840 people trained in the Construction Gateway in preparation for the economic expansion that this government will deliver and has already started to deliver because the Pierhead project starting just now, Mr. President. And we didn't do this yesterday, Mr. President. Listen, and because they say that we just do a Barbados and only belong to the rich, I heard that statement in here. But let me see who the Construction Gateway. Who the Construction Gateway? Let me get people that train in backhoe operation, Mr. President. Let me bring my microphone. People train to do electrical installation, Mr. President, photovoltaic installation, Mr. President, plumbing, steel bending, textured wall coating application, tiling, welding. Who them is? People. 2,840 people, Mr. President, trained through the Construction Gateway of this government to make sure that we upskill the average Barbadian, Mr. President, to be able to find jobs within this. And Mr. President, not only did we do the training, but we provided certification for them so that the welders, Mr. President, and the plumbers who didn't have certification but just know how to do a thing could walk away now, Mr. President, with certification from doing this program like anybody else to show, Mr. President, that they have been able, again, Mr. President, to be trained and upskilled to be able to earn a living, Mr. President, in this economy. Money in the pocket, Mr. President, of people, Mr. President, of people, Mr. President. Anywhere in the world, Mr. President, people can go and work anywhere in the world. Mr. President, this government, you talk about minimum wage, the private sector was telling me don't bring the minimum wage, delay it, we can destroy the economy. And this government stood steadfast, Mr. President, and was determined despite the criticism because of what people, Mr. President. We did the labor clauses, Mr. President, when the private sector was keeping noise and jumping up and saying, hold on. And this government said it would labor because who? People, Mr. President. What was the benefit for the government in terms of labor clauses? It was about people. It was about enfranchising people. It's because this government knows where we come from, Mr. President. And when we talk, Mr. President, about the same training programs, I got to give you the objectives and the goals, Mr. President, because it's important. Because see, we got vision. We don't just do programs. We got vision. We do not just do programs. We know what we're doing and we're doing it for. We had to ensure the provision of a highly skilled workforce to meet the demands of the construction sector because we know what we got in the pocket coming, Mr. President. What we got in the pocket coming, Mr. President. To develop and provide training and retraining opportunities for workers across the construction sector. To facilitate a tools lease arrangement. Mr. President, wait, hold on. So not only training, if I understand it correctly. So somebody in here, I can beg you, if I am not, please correct me. It says to facilitate a tools lease arrangement. So that means that they was able to get some tools as well, Mr. President.
Yes.
It sounds so to everybody here.
Yes.
That the government provided training, but also provided equipment that they could then go out, Mr. President, to get the work and the jobs as well. People, Mr. President, practical people. It got to be more, Mr. President, than beating the chest and pointing the finger, Mr. President, jumping up the chair. I will tell you that one of the things that this government has not been good at is beating its own chest, and I will admit that. We are too humble for our own good. But one of the things that having an opposition will do for this party, I can tell you, Mr. President, is to defend the record of the Barbados Labour Party and this government. Mr. President, they say that we should have started this debate, not started the debate, the presentation in the well. And it's interesting, yeah? Because we are to be again tutored about governance and changing governance system that needs to be put in place. This government that introduced the well in the first place to give Barbados an opportunity to hear ministers under scrutiny. We are to forget, Mr. President, that it was this government that introduced the PAC. That happened. That we have a prime minister, that has reduced her powers, Mr. President, again, in order to make sure that we have greater transparency of institutions. But again, Mr. President, we are to be tutored. They asked, Mr. President, about the commitment for results department. They said, since that is the overarching frame for transformation, why not start with that? Mr. President, for us, the proof of the pudding is not about staring at it, it is about eating it, Mr. President. So we didn't need to bring the commitment for results department in the well when all of the other departments that we have been working with for over the past 2 years, Mr. President, were the ones to be on show. Mr. President, I will inform this chamber and the public that is listening that as we went through internally our estimates process, every single government department that came before the Prime Minister to present the estimates had to show 4 things, Mr. President. One, that had to show their own CFR commitment for results, Mr. President. 2, they had to show, Mr. President, how they were deconstructing and reconstructing their departments. 3, they had to show how their ministries were going to achieve the 6 missions that we had, because they were read out in here, Mr. President, and it was asked, so I am responding, Mr. President, how are we measuring? Every single government department had to have a plan that said, this is how we are going to achieve, Mr. President. And 4, we had to show how we are going to include, or not how we're going to include, but the elements for climate tagging that were within our budgets, Mr. President, making sure that we build out as well the climate resilience. Remember I talked about those pillars that were in the BERT, about climate and building climate resilience. Mr. President, we are not just doing policy, we have vision. We understand that transformation has to be not a silo, but fully integrated into the work, that you can be able to take a picture and look and continue to see the elements of it throughout government policy, Mr. President. So we have the commitment for results frame embedded, Mr. President. And what has each government department now has to do is every quarter report, Mr. President, on their progress towards the metrics that are contained within the CFR. Further, Mr. President, we were told, it was read from the budget, under the head for the CFR department is 0034 under Prime Minister's office, Mr. President. I can give you everything there. Mr. President, it was read out that the professional services, which is 226, and again, Mr. President, you know I'm going to go through this because there had to be a little bit of tutoring in the other place about the estimates. So before I'm asked or before I'm forced to, I can make sure that I provide necessary explanations so that people don't only read the top headlines, but they understand the intricacies of the estimates and what they present. So at 226, at professional services, so we were told that it went up from 100,000 to 500,000 for this financial year, 2024 to 2025. Mr. President, when I came into government in 2022, and I happened to be minister with responsibility for the CFR, you know how much staff the CFR department got, Mr. President? You want to know how much staff the permanent secretary and the minister, which is me. The permanent secretary. See, the minister said, don't count me, so on. That is how the CFR department has been operating from 2022 when I came in to near the end of the last quarter, 2023. So as we build out the program for the CFR department, that $500,000 is not about bringing in heavy name consultants, but it's about delivering, Mr. President. So that $500,000, one, the CFR department, when we started, we were going to use the CFR portal that was advised from the Commonwealth Secretariat, Mr. President. But these Barbadians, we don't beg every time that I want, see something, see the minister, I got call the Commonwealth Secretariat and so somebody open the portal. Something happened, I got wait for them to find somebody, Senator King, to open the portal. So we said no. So we had to build our own. So that took some time for us to build our own. The money that is in here under that professional services 226 is what making sure that we can have maintenance, that we can hire an IT professional, Mr. President, in order to be able to maintain that portal. What it will also do importantly, Mr. President, as you would know, the government has just launched the call center in order to be able to provide citizens is the same thing as people, because if I use big words, you may get a little confused. Citizens is the same thing as people, to provide people within Barbados the opportunity to air their grievances about what the delivery of government services, Senator Thompson, because we are not afraid to hold ourselves accountable to the people of Barbados. We are not hiding from constructive criticism, and the call center was particularly established that Barbadians can call in and say, no, hold on, Mr. President, but we want to go further. And that $500,000 is going to allow us to be able to devise a system where we integrate across the public service all of the customer complaints mechanisms and then create customer standards, Mr. President, for the entire public service to be more responsive to the people that we serve. That is the $500,000 in there, Mr. President. That is the $500,000 in there for the Commitment for Results Department. Mr. President, there were questions asked as well about culture. All of this talk, oh shoot, got me ready to sing, Mr. President, about culture. Mr. President, we heard a lot about the measure that was introduced for visual artists, Mr. President. We heard what this needs to do and what it shouldn't be, what it shouldn't do, and all of this other things. Mr. President, I want to advise, and again, because I am part of this government, and we face it, Mr. President, that I completely agree it is not satisfactory that we do not have a national art gallery. I have said that to the visual artists. I would say that publicly, Mr. President, because that is the truth. It's not satisfactory. The government has to be able to deliver on a national art gallery. But even, Mr. President, as we are facing that and fixing it, this government has been working with the visual artists, the Barbados National Arts Council. Again, look at the estimates, don't just read the top lines. We have increased their subvention, Mr. President, from $10,000, Mr. President, from $10,000 to over $30-something thousand that they were not getting before. We have increased it, Mr. President. Mr. President, not only that, we have had over, sorry, don't find it in here because I don't want to talk off the top of my head. I gotta make sure that I do facts and figures, Mr. President. Through the National Cultural Foundation, we have had over, in 2023, 10 art exhibitions created at the Queen's Park Art Gallery. And to date, over 160,000 worth in art, Mr. President, has been sold directly from the gallery, Mr. President. An average of 23 artists featured at each exhibition, with something on average of 500 patrons visiting each exhibition. Mr. President, I want to ask a question, if I may. The same people who jump up with such passion, Mr. President, about the measure for visual arts, I want to ask them, how many pieces of art do you have in your own house? It is not about the talk, it is about the direct support for the artists, and that's what his government is doing, Mr. President. And not only that, the budget that is there under the Division of Culture for the National Art Gallery is money that goes to a board, Mr. President, National Art Gallery Board, that oversees and has oversight, Mr. President, for the development of the National Art Collection. And to date, Mr. President, we have spent over $105,000 this year alone in acquiring art from visual artists as part of the National Art Collection. As well, Mr. President, under a project from the Tourism Development Corporation, they will also have a space, a small space, Mr. President, but nevertheless a space that will be developed, Mr. President, for visual artists. So even as we face and fix the fact that we have to deliver a national art gallery, Mr. President, we are delivering for people, for the artists, for the visual artists. But Mr. President, I ain't done yet. Because you would think I ain't done. Mr. President, they talk about all sorts of incentives that should be done. Mr. President, I don't know if many people know that there is a Cultural Industries Act. That Cultural Industries Act was passed, Mr. President, in 2013 under the Democratic Labour Party. So I had to ask a question. Okay, so the Cultural Industries Act was passed, and I will talk about what the Cultural Industries Act, Mr. President, in the Cultural Industry Development Act contains. But, Mr. President, under the Democratic Labour Party, only the film sector was allowed a duty-free concession at 2015. It was under the Barbados Labour Party in 2019 that duty-free concessions were made accessible to all registered practitioners in Barbados. Somebody clap for that. Because them is people, Mr. President. So you enact legislation talking about people, but this government had to come in 2019 and make sure that across the cultural sector that we could provide for practitioners by making sure that they had full access, Mr. President. And the Cultural Industries Act, Mr. President, provides them for exemptions from duties and taxes, and I'm reading, Mr. President, I'm quoting from the Act itself. Imports of equipment, imports of operating non-capital supplies, building materials purchased locally, other capital assets as well. When a government entity is a cultural entrepreneur or cultural practitioner, it shall be exempt from the payment of all duties and taxes on imports used for the construction and furnishing of a new building or for the renovation and furnishing of an existing building. Mr. President, this is what cultural practitioners in Barbados, because of the Barbados Labour Party, have access to, Mr. President. Those are people, Mr. President. This is what we are delivering. This is what we are delivering, and it is important because when we talk about social and economic development, we sometimes only see particular strands. We look, yes, at what is happening within the social ministries, but we forget culture and the importance of culture. But this government does not, because this government understands that fundamentally we need to be able to leverage the building of the national consciousness of Barbadians. And that when we do so, when we are able to build that national consciousness, Mr. President, then we are able to galvanize Barbadian people. It is why we were able to withstand COVID. It wasn't only the government policies, it was because there was something in the belly of Barbadians. And that is what building the national consciousness. And that is why this government continues to invest in culture. That is why during COVID, the Prime Minister made $1 million available to cultural practitioners. It is why, Mr. President, in the last budget, she gave $2 million to fashion, Mr. President. And that had nothing to do, Mr. President, with the funds that are available under the same Cultural Industries Development Act, Mr. President. Under the Cultural Industries Development Act, there's a Cultural Industries Development Fund, Mr. President. That fund has a technical assistance grant. It has a product development grant. It has a project execution grant, Mr. President. Two of those grants, Mr. President, can get up to a maximum of $30,000, Mr. President. And again, because I am facts, Mr. President, I can tell you that over the last 4 years, that fund, Mr. President, has delivered over $4.1 million, Mr. President, $4.1 million to cultural practitioners across this country. Them is people too, Mr. President, cultural practitioners, because we understand that the investment in culture and the arts and the people who do it, Mr. President, is an investment in building our societies and our communities, is an investment in building resilience in the orange economy, Mr. President. For this year, Mr. President, January 2023 to December 2023, that fund has delivered over $300,000 in grants. Sponsorship is separate, Mr. President, $158,684. Total approved, $428,988, Mr. President, in grants. Duty-free concessions by themselves, Mr. President, just under $1 million, Mr. President. This is what we are doing practically, Mr. President. I can tell you, Mr. President, because I have it here, that in that year of all of those grants and partnerships, and sponsorship, the beneficiaries, 36% female, 64% male, and I'm happy with that statistic, but we can work on it. 36, all people though, all people. Mr. President, I got it here. I can even give you the breakdown by the sectors who were able to benefit, Mr. President. Fashion, music, education, theater, literary arts, new media, and web design, Mr. President. All people working in the orange economy, benefiting, Mr. President, from the work of this government. Mr. President, I know it getting a little bit more listen, Mr. President, I don't know if I can give you permission to take off your jacket, because he got to be hot by now. He got to be hot by now, Mr. President. Sorry, the Honourable Senator. Sorry, I apologize. The Honourable Senator, who is the only member for the opposition now in their seat at this particular time, left to take all of the heat.
The one that Ronnie doesn't like.
Left to take all of the heat, Mr. President. But that is okay. Mr. President, that is okay. Because I have more licks to come.
Oh dear.
I have more to come, Mr. President. Because we're not making sport when we talk particularly about culture and the delivery of culture and what it is that this government is intending to do. Because, you know, Mr. President, when I talk about vision and having that reflective moment, we understand carefully as well that if we can, like I said before, build that national consciousness, it means that then we can begin to address some of the social problems and challenges that we are having within our communities. And therefore, the work that you will see and the monies that you will see here, particularly for programming under the National Cultural Foundation, it's about grounding the work in communities, in ordinary people, Mr. President. We have what is called an intangible cultural... We have what is called an intangible cultural heritage community training program, Mr. President. We go through communities in Barbados, the length and breadth, Mr. President. The length and breadth, Mr. President, of communities. I just come to the land share. And road tennis. I got that day too, Mr. President. I come in, road tennis and land share. So, Mr. President, we had the ICH community training program, Mr. President. I will tell you, Mr. President, we trained over 486 people, Mr. President, from all over Barbados in every community. Right now, It is the last of the third in a series of community drama programs when we are taking ordinary Barbadians, Mr. President, to teach them not only, Mr. President, to act, because we don't just want them only to act, we're teaching them the whole spectrum of how to do theater. So some of them writing, Mr. President, getting trained to write, Mr. President. Some of them doing costuming, Mr. President, so they know how to do costuming. Some of them doing lights, Mr. President. We are empowering because it is not just about the instrumental thing of taking them up, but we are making sure that we are instilling the skills that are necessary, Mr. President. Mr. President, we did a landship teacher certification program. I'm coming to my landship now, Mr. President. We have an ICH in schools program, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to look particularly for this as I talk about the landship. Mr. President, we have a schools, please, we got a school, my side, thank you, a schools landship program. Mr. President, we trained 232 students at 7 primary schools and 98 students at 5 secondary schools, trained in all aspects of landship movement last year, Mr. President. This year, we are going to deliver 150 students at 5 primary and secondary schools each, Mr. President. And they are performing out, Mr. President, because we understand the importance of cultural heritage. And that is why this government, Mr. President, is seeking to make sure that internationally through UNESCO, that we will inscribe for urgent safeguarding landship, Mr. President, because it is ours. It is one of the own indigenous forms or forms that we have, and we have to make sure that it does not die out. So we have agreed, the cabinet recently, to make sure that we will have this inscription. Not only that, Mr. President, the National Cultural Foundation as well, through the landship programs that I spoke about. We have had through workshops, performances, educational material, Mr. President. All of this, approximately 300 participants, Mr. President, in 2003. That is the investment that we are making, Mr. President. And not in 2023. And not only landship, further we are inscribing road tennis, Mr. President. Road tennis, Mr. President, for recognition. Oh, and so, from also all the way from St. Michael Northwest, right? Okay, you'll be familiar with that. Thank you very much for that, Honourable Senator. We have our inscribing road tennis. And why are we doing that, Mr. President? This government is doing that, Mr. President, because we understand the investment that is needed in cultural heritage and the people who plays road tennis. Mr. President, who plays road tennis? It is the average Barbadian out there playing road tennis. And we are making sure that these elements of our culture are going to be held in the highest esteem, and that's why we have taken them, Mr. President, to the UN to make sure that there is recognition, Mr. President, for these things. Mr. President, I could go on and talk about the digital children's books. I could go on, Mr. President, and talk about what we have done with fashion in Ghana. Hold on, I gotta go onto the table for this one. Because I don't just talk. I don't just talk culture and the arts. I don't just talk culture and the arts, Mr. President. I have an engagement, Mr. President, later on. This bag is locally made, supported through the National Cultural Foundation Business Development Program, Mr. President. The necklace I got on, orange bag from Orange Economy, the necklace I got on, Mr. President. The necklace I got on, local businesswoman supported through the National Cultural Foundation, Mr. President. That is what we are doing when you talk about business for people. And them small business people that we are capacitating, Mr. President, and providing opportunities to through the business development program. All of the young people that we took, Mr. President, to Ghana, Accra, all of them have gotten orders, Mr. President. All of them have gotten orders, Mr. President. Took them to Accra. That is what the $2 million investment is doing and is producing, Mr. President. Tangible things. Tangible things, Mr. President. Mr. President, For people. I know that my time is running out.
We don't call it the Prime Minister's office at one time.
Oh, this is culture that was on the Prime Minister's office that was supposed to be cut in half? Senator King, this is culture that was under the Prime Minister's office. That was recommended by the leader of the opposition to be cut. And they want to come, Mr. President, and tell us about people value the orange economy, beat their chests and cry out that the concession is enough, Mr. President. But cut it, cut the money, cut the money. Cut the money for the people, cut the money for my friend, the lady who did this bag, Mr. President. But she loves small business, Mr. President. This young girl who made this chain, Mr. President, she just happened to be my namesake. She named Chantal too. This is what she does full time, Mr. President. This is her job full time. So this is what we would have been imperiling because we just want to take a pen. We just want to take a pen because we don't have vision, Mr. President. We don't understand value, Mr. President. We don't understand how to make the transformative investment in people, because this government understands that when we do that, and particularly for women,
Are you working pay for the farm and those years?
that when we do that investment for women, we empower households, Mr. President. We empower communities, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I wrap, I want to commend this appropriations bill. I commend this appropriations bill, Mr. President. Yes, I'm on the government side. But I heard from the honourable senators in here, from a couple of them, that delivered sensible presentations. That this process should be seen as one of about national development. That we should focus not on the politics of this thing, but that we should focus on the people and what is best for the people. And I ask all of them to put aside the political immaturities, to put aside the lack of intestinal fortitude, and to be able to see the program, the transformative program that the government is doing and producing for the people of Barbados. And if they see that, they will support it, Mr. President. I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Honourable Chantal Monroe-Knight. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to beg for the suspension of the honourable sitting of the Senate until 3:15 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 3:15 p.m. today. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore suspended until 3:15 p.m. today.